Hi, my name is John Menard, the creator of CrispCube, an upcoming indie game. And I wanted to make this video to examine Counter-Strike as to where it was 20 years ago, where it is today, and possibly where it could go. And the first aspect I wanted to focus on was monetization. When Counter-Strike first came out, it was sort of just like a product, right? You bought the game, Valve made their money, and that was sort of the end of it. The issue with that is whenever you have a game like that with a product, you know, you're sort of incentivized, or the developers are incentivized to release multiple versions of the game. And the side effect of that is it's sort of split the community, for example, when Source came out, because at the time, people wanted to play 1.6 and also wanted to play Source. So when people said, do you play Counter-Strike, you had to specify which version. To a lesser extent, there was a Counter-Strike Condition 0, but that didn't really take off nearly as much as any other versions of the Counter-Strike, like Go, 1.6, or Source. Today, things are much better because, you know, the game is a service, right? You have skins that you buy, Valve makes money from those, and they're able to pay creators to some level of those skins, from what I understand. And it's sort of just a much more fluid experience from like a revenue stream perspective. They don't need to keep re-releasing a new Counter-Strike iteration or map packs, which would also potentially split the community. And that's really great because it allows sort of everybody to be on the same page. It also allows them revenue to develop future content, and it's really put Counter-Strike in a really great place. The next subject I wanted to talk about, or broach, was the whole idea behind map pools and maps in general. I think maps in Counter-Strike are tremendously important, and Valve has recognized that as well. They're totally aware of it. But I think that the way that maps have been chosen in the past and have been chosen today could be improved quite a bit. So in the early days with Counter-Strike, you could actually like submit your map and they would like look at the maps and just take the maps and put them in the game. But that was when like Counter-Strike wasn't super popular. But even that system didn't last very long. By 1.6, you know, or when version literally 1.6 came out, that had long been abandoned because there was just no way to like go through that amount of maps. Today, what you see more often is sort of like, there's sort of like two main sources of maps, which are, you know, the official Valve maps, like, you know, this one, Dust 2, which is actually made by another guy called Barney, I believe. And there are other maps contributed from like map makers like Cache or Cache or however the heck you want to say it. That's primarily where the maps come from, right? You have the Valve developed maps and you have third-party map makers who sort of contribute to the maps, and Valve sort of, you know, gets together and decides what maps are going to be in the competitive pool or the casual pool or what have you. The issue with that is, you know, there's really no player testing for a lot of the competitive maps, and the problem with that is one of the things that people don't realize about map making is 99% of the effort to make a map goes into the polishing, not necessarily the layouts and stuff like that. So something I would love to see with Counter-Strike is moving to a direction where we sort of gray box maps. Either it could be, you know, voted by pros or the community or a little bit of both, or also Valve could contribute to that, where we gray box maps, which is sort of like maps with just, you know, gray box textures with, you know, the grid and the units. You might have also seen the maps with the orange texture. Those are pretty popular as well. So we sort of get the rough layout of a bunch of maps, find out which ones play the best, and then from there we polish the map. What I'm not a huge fan of, or what I don't think provides a lot of value, is to sort of go to a real life location and see if like, oh, can we turn this into a map? I feel like that is sort of working backwards, because you could end up putting a lot of polish on a map that is not totally well received by the community. I could have told you in advance that Vertigo would not be well received by the community for a variety of reasons, but even if they just play tested it, they would have gotten that feedback well before they invested all this time polishing that map. You know, no discredit to the people who polished Vertigo, it looks amazing. It just, I don't think plays as good as people were hoping for. The other subject I wanted to talk about was Anticheat. So 20 years ago, when Counter-Strike actually came out, there was literally absolutely no anti-cheat. You could just load whatever the heck you wanted, wall hack, aimbot, whatever you wanted to do, and, you know, Bob's your uncle. After that, this is pre-Steam, by the way, there were like Punkbuster services, which are like clients you could run, but even those weren't that great. People frequently got around them. And from there, you know, after Counter-Strike moved to Steam, VAC was introduced, right? Valve Anticheat. And, you know, Valve has invested a lot in VAC, you know, to their credit, but the reality is, you know, people are always going to find a way to get around VAC. There were people I've played with who literally bragged about the brand of cheats they were playing with for months in matchmaking, which is probably why I don't play it so much. And there's no developer or team in the world that could literally cheat-proof their game entirely. You can throw a lot of resources at it. You can get really good at catching most of the cheaters, but to 100% eliminate cheating is impossible unless there are some major technology changes. And what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, we live in a world where streaming services like Google Stadia achieve 0 millisecond lag, which is probably impossible, but who knows. That world probably could have perfect anti-cheat, because that way people running Counter-Strike or playing Counter-Strike wouldn't be able to interface with the memory or anything that relates to the game code. And that would sort of perfectly eliminate cheating 100% because there's just no way around it. That's not really practical though. I think a more practical solution would be to have a console that people can't get into, that is sort of locked, if you will, that you can plug in your mouse and keyboard that could run Counter-Strike, you know, at the frame rates that we need, which is like, you know, 144 frames. Sometimes people even play on like 240 hertz monitors. That could actually meet those needs. That way people couldn't get in there, if you will, to modify the game code, or at least it would be a lot more challenging. Consoles frequently are hacked, but they're a lot more difficult to hack than a PC, which are sort of like, you know, anybody can sort of open different programs to get in there. But today, the reality is if you want a good anti-cheat experience, you have to play on a client, right? ESEA or FACEIT, what have you, where different means are taken to maybe be a little more aggressive to find cheats on people's computers. But even that's not bulletproof, because sometimes they're not 100% sure, and they will actually have people play in a studio, for example. I think that happened with a player called Rops. They just didn't know. This guy was so good, right? They had to see him play in person to actually verify that he was legit. So that goes to tell you, you know, like, nobody is 100% free from cheats. There's always going to be a way to get around it, at least for now. The next thing I wanted to talk about were tick rates. For those who don't necessarily know what a tick rate is, there are different things in games that update every so often. Some things will update as often as possible, such as your frame rate, but other things will update less frequent than that usually. And so what happens is we have these computers that can run Counter-Strike at like 300-400 frames a second, but the servers themselves are only running at, you know, like 60 or tick, which is, you know, the big complaint. Or if you get a 120 tick server, then, you know, things feel a lot smoother. And the reason for that is because all the physics, all the shots, all that stuff is being updated in real time to real time, as well as doing processing to play back shots, if you will, to make sure that shots are aligning with what the player saw. They're doing that, you know, roughly the equivalency of the tick rate. So 60 for a lot of people aren't able to notice that difference, to be honest with you. But as soon as players get to a certain skill level, that no longer cuts it. And the main issue that I see with Valve is that they've sort of decided to wholeheartedly make everything 60 tick in matchmaking and not have any point where 120 tick is introduced. To get that 120 tick experience, you have to use third-party things like FACEIT and ESEA. That's kind of suboptimal. What I would love to see, I think, would be that as soon as you reach a certain rank in matchmaking, then it would shift over to 120 tick. That way, as players got better and more sort of nuanced into the game, they would be able to get that hyper responsive game that people talk about. The difference between 120 and 120 and 60 is that, you know, people do die a little bit quicker from sprays. Grenades move a little bit different, and just generally the game feels just a little bit smoother. And that would be something that I would love to get from Valve. One thing that doesn't get any attention is the fact that you just can't at all change your field of view in Counter-Strike. It's sort of locked in there. And you might ask, well, why is that a big deal? So the problem with not being able to change your field of view is that people do other things to get a similar effect. So for example, you'll see people play with like black bars at 1024 by 768, which effectively reduces their field of view. And I think what would be a lot cooler is if you could play at 1080p, but just narrow your field of view. That way you could focus on less screen. Some players prefer, some people actually play at native 1080p, but some people like to play, at 1024 by 768 with the black bars are stretched. And I think that having field of view be adjustable to some degree would really eliminate the need for a lot of that, although probably not entirely, and would make it sort of less silly for people needing to switch resolutions to get black bar and stuff like that. Another thing that goes hand in hand with the field of view argument is the whole idea of texture clarity. And you might say, well, why is that important? So whenever you're looking at player models in environments, if the environment has very detailed textures, has a lot of grit, if you will, it can be very difficult to spot models against that. Whereas if you have sort of a softer pastel kind of texture, it's a lot easier to see. And I think that players being able to blur the world textures, maybe not to a crazy degree, but to some degree, would make visibility of player models a lot better. It wouldn't dramatically change the game, but it would be nice to have. So with that, guys, that's the end of this video. Like, subscribe, or whatever. If you want to mow your lawn instead, you do that instead. But that's sort of like what I wanted to talk about at a high level. If people have like more, I guess, granular questions about netcode or what have you, I'm totally free to talk about that. Just let me know in the comments. Thank you.